don't go to conventions. Ever. And this is something that confuses a lot of people because every time a new MLP convention is announced, people ask me if they're going to see me there, and I have to explain to them that this sounds like a horrid idea. Putting aside the fact that it just costs too much money, there's nothing a Brony convention can offer that is considerably better in a more accessible environment. Oh, but you can watch the new episode in a theater! But that's just worse than watching it in my living room because I can't pause it and make quips, and I have to be packed in a small room with dozens of other people who all smell vaguely of cheese. This does tend to be hard for people to grasp, but we've built our own community here. I don't necessarily make videos for Bronies, I make them for my own viewers. The two just overlap quite a fair bit. But if I wanted to go to a convention, I'd host my own. We'll call it LilyCon. Wait, no, that sounds too much like something else. Maybe keep workshopping that. So I'm guessing many of you saw Fame and Misfortune and were gleefully hoping that I would bring the thunder down on this episode and raking DHX over the coals for their clear and obvious bitterness toward criticism they take extremely personally, and we'll get into that, but probably not in the aggressive drag 'em way you were hoping for, because I agree with the nucleus of the episode. So let's first take a look at what Fame and Misfortune wants to say before we look at what it actually says. 1. DHX clearly prioritizes themes over everything else. If you're not paying attention to the lessons first and foremost, you're doing it wrong. 2. DHX, like most professional writers, considers not relatable or can't root for to not be valid criticisms because they aren't. 3. DHX finds all this nonsense about lore and backstory and continuity and insignificant plot details to be a huge disrespect to their writing, and it is. These are all things I've talked about at length and devoted a huge number of glass of water videos to. In fact, delousing the analysis community has become a regular staple of my job and is the reason so many of you love me so much. The fact of the matter is that most of the things DHX specifically addresses in Fame and Misfortune are problems. The hyper-focusing on insignificant details over the themes continues to be a rampant problem in the community, even after this episode aired and a new Changeling episode came out and people still ignored the themes to hyper-focus on the science behind the hive. The obsession with characters in a black or white, good or bad scenario with no room for nuance is a problem, as it leads to episodes where the characters do bad things because they have to learn from the consequences of their actions, being decried as out of character, despite those characters never having been put into the boxes we thought they were put in. Alicorn Twilight was considered the death of the show by idiots who think marketing is the worst thing ever, despite the fact that every instance of marketing in Friendship is Magic has been directly responsible for the best ideas the show ever had. Rainbow Dash's obsessive fans being entirely children is rather on point, considering that for the longest time, Rainbow Dash was considered the best pony by insecure man-children entirely because she was the least feminine of the group. And one thing that characterizes Bronies is a massive insecurity for watching a children's show, so they need to keep reassuring themselves that it's actually totally manly, no really stop laughing. I mean, hell, Fob Equestria was built on the idea of proving that not all Bronies are wimps and that not all people in the military are violent thugs, and it failed in both of those goals because of course it did. When your identity is built on insecurity, nobody believes you when you try to pretend that you're not. Of course, Rainbow Dash does also tend to appeal most to children because she's got that confident attitude that kids like and admire, but I'd be surprised if actual children were who DHX was referring to when they characterized Rainbow fans as insufferably smug knobsacks who consider higher themes bowing. And then we have Rarity, for whom it's never explicitly stated why people dislike her, only giving vague non-reasons for it, like, oh, the nerve! She's so arrogant and full of herself! And this reflects the attitude of a lot of people who rate Rarity because she's prissy, or snobby, or thinks she's better than others, another imaginary and yet still trivial wrongdoing. The only standout among the crowd is when Fluttershy is being berated by ponies who want to know why she keeps learning the same lesson over and over again, and attempts to refute this with talks about how change is gradual and not instantaneous. And this is where DHX fucked up, because they tried to address valid criticisms of the show the same way they were addressing the hysterical nitpicks. Here are where the problems present themselves. 1. DHX already fixed this. This criticism is 3 years old, and the most vocal person banging that drum at the time was me. And it seems that DHX knew this, considering that Lemon Chiffon's cutie mark has none too subtly changed to a glass of water. There's some talk about it meaning the glass half empty saying, but considering this is an episode that actively acknowledges the criticism from the analysis community, and because another specific shout out is made later on, I'm gonna go with Occam's razor on this one. But I digress. Fluttershy episodes stopped having this problem in the latter half of season 4, and she's been the best character who gets the best episodes in season 5, 6, and 7. What makes this stand out is that DHX is trying to dismiss criticism that they already took on board and addressed. 2. Fluttershy's criticism wasn't character criticism. You remember how in Brute Force I talked about how Celestia's constant defeats weren't character problems, but rather story problems that were independent of her character? That's the same deal with Fluttershy. Fluttershy episodes are predominantly built around assertiveness, but a big problem over the first few seasons was that she was constantly hitting the reset button and relearning that concept. Ideally, she would learn that lesson once and then learn all the different ways it can be applied. And after Feely Vanilli, it seemed that DHX actually started doing that by putting Fluttershy into situations where she had to stand up to her friends, had to assert herself for another person's own good, or learn the very nuances of kindness. Or to put it in universe, why did Fluttershy write down her resolution to be more assertive 12 times when once would have sufficed? Why did Fluttershy need to reiterate that she has stage fright and a fear of performances a dozen times? Those questions can't be answered because it's not a character problem. DHX recycled the same plot too many times and it got boring. Simple as. 3. Fluttershy's change was instantaneous. The difference between Feely Vanilli and It Ain't Easy Being Breezy's is like night and day. Between these two episodes, Fluttershy became almost a completely different person. Before this point, Fluttershy's anxiety was inflated to extreme and ridiculous proportions, often to the point of hallucinating and leaving many people to assert that maybe she needs more than just assertiveness training. Maybe she needs to see a doctor about it because nobody's going to look at this and conclude that this is normal. But once It Ain't Easy Being Breezy's aired, Fluttershy jolted into the kind of character she'd always intended to be. Shy and anxious around crowds, and certainly doesn't like Halloween, but is not so paralyzed with fear that even talking to her friends is an impossible task, and confrontations with people no longer require an extreme rush of adrenaline. Fluttershy's characterization of anxiety before this point was extremely problematic and it needed to stop. It wasn't a matter of character growth, it was a matter of shit-awful writing, and that stuff isn't changed gradually. It's only changed when the writer decides to stop doing the terrible thing they're doing. Hence why Fluttershy's characterization between season 4 and season 5 is like looking at two completely different characters. All of these things are ignored in favor of painting the criticism as expecting immediate character changes, which is the same kind of deflection that many people who really liked Fluttershy engaged in as well, trying to argue about gradual growth of a personality when confronted with criticism of story structure and repetition. Either they didn't actually grasp the criticism itself, or making that excuse is just easier. But this is the point where DHX showed their hand because they nitpicked a criticism that was itself so valid and detailed that it resulted in them actually changing their approach to this character. Lemon Chiffon even appears later to make one of those god-awful brainless criticisms about Fluttershy being impossible to relate to, while a pony wearing Fluttershy merchandise slinks away in shame. Which is weird because I'm very good friends with someone who loves Fluttershy and thinks Fluttershy is totally relatable, and whenever I criticized the character, she never crawled away in shame. She whipped out the sock'em boppers and yelled, "I didn't start this war, but it's on!" DHX had enough breathing room to get away with this because discourse surrounding Friendship is Magic is flooded with bullshit and plot nitpicks and lore obsessions, but a lot of valid and well thought out criticism continues to surface for the show, and it ends up being completely ignored save for Fluttershy. And that exception reveals DHX's hand that they're sniping at people because they don't like getting negative reception, and trying to discredit their critics as insufferable pissants getting indignant over nothing is easier than being right. This culminates in a musical number where they attempt to just write everything off with, well, they're not flawless, so shut up. But then again, even that's a contentious point. Some people saw the We're Not Flawless song as being a celebration of the fact that the main six can't live without everyone else, and criticism itself. And like the glass of water cutie mark, we find the real answer by diving into the meta. Yes, in a contextless vacuum, this number can be taken one of two ways. Taking the musical number itself on its own merits, its intended message is vague and open to interpretation. But musical numbers don't exist in a vacuum. The number itself might be open to interpretation, but the sneering dismissal of the main six to the rest of the town, the characterization of the town as hyperactive lunatics, the only valid criticism actually being mentioned in universe being so thoroughly mischaracterized, Starlight explicitly saying it's not their problem, it's every pony else's, and how none of the more critical criticisms of the show even get so much as a passing mention in favor of cherry-picking the most easily refuted nitpicks show the real motivation. They are very much trying to use the characters aren't flawless argument as a way to defang criticism, or at the very least make a poor attempt to refute it. Fame and Misfortune is DHX explicitly saying what they've been implicitly saying all season. When Starlight Glimmer became the base-breaking character and it was obvious that a few cute faces weren't going to work this time, DHX's response was to shove her harder in people's faces and gluing her onto every potentially good story idea the fandom might like. So if you liked Maud, Trixie, Thorax, Discord, or Sunset, not only do you have to put up with Starlight being there, you also have to put up with Starlight being the most capable pony in the room because everyone else else's brain fell out. There have been base-breaking characters before, but never to her degree, and never has DHX responded by shoving those characters in your face as much as possible. The fact is, DHX is proud of the ideas they've had, and they don't like it when it isn't received well, and this is their very poor attempt to defang criticisms with old and tired thought-terminating cliches. Maybe the argument that the characters aren't flawless would have worked if it wasn't also the go-to response for uncritical douchebags who get mad when someone says their favorite show isn't perfect. We as critics have had a very long time to think about why this response doesn't mean anything and why the people who make it are idiots. DHX is about 7 years late to that party, and they've drawn a trap card after it's already been nerfed. The fact is, pulling the characters aren't flawless card validates all this criticism. It doesn't dismiss it. Even when we're contending with criticism of an episode that rests on a foundation of characters shouldn't do shitty things ever. All criticism of the mysterious ne'er-do-well and putting your hoof down is built on the assumption that the characters in question are flawless, or should be flawless, or that their flaws are tiny hashtag relatable quirks. An assumption that is itself completely false. But the characters not being perfect validates the existence of discourse surrounding their actions, despite the fact that a lot of that discourse is kinda stupid. You engage with bad criticism and bad opinions by detailing why they're bad, not by pulling out thought-terminating cliches because actually thinking is too hard for you. You know, it's easy to look at the people who talk about this stuff and care about this stuff and say, get a life, but the phrase get a life has rarely ever been more than a thought-terminating cliche pulled out by assholes who can't win arguments. For 90% of the community, this is their hobby. For the other 10%, it's literally their day job. Imagine if I walked into a Tim Hortons and told the people behind the counter to get a life. Imagine if I walked into a bar and told the people watching the hockey game to get a life. You'd look at me like I'm a raving lunatic. The exact kind of raving lunatic you are being when you think telling people to get a life means anything. Yes, some people in the community really need to go outside and stop jerking off into their own mouths, and the phrase get a life is perfectly valid for them, but they're the exceptions that prove the rule. Shouting get a life is the same kind of deflection we talked about in Discord Princess and Bug Spray, where one can't actually contend with the criticism in question, and so instead opts to try and discredit their opponent with irrelevant assumptions about their personal lives. Or to put it more directly, even if I was a pathetic, jobless loser living in my mother's basement, I'm still right. According to M.A. Larson, this episode was written for Season 5 and shelved, and that his original script had a huge number of changes made to it, such as Starlight taking the role that was originally intended for Spike, because of course she did. And I believe that, because it explains a lot of the discrepancies with the writing, such as Fluttershy being lambasted for not being able to assert herself 3 years after she stopped having that problem. But more to the fact that this is what the staff of Season 7 do. Every season the showrunners have some continuous problem plaguing their work, and in Season 7 it's their pride. It's their pride that makes them snipe at critics. It's pride that makes them think they don't have to do any real work with a cool premise and can just jingle their keys in your face. It's pride that makes them shove their new favorite character into every possible corner they can when people complain about them doing that. It's very reminiscent of Blizzard Entertainment. The randomness of loot and unfair nature of the RNG system has been a constant complaint in World of Warcraft since its launch. Blizzard's response every time has been to add more randomness with every expansion when the community wants less, and RNG plagues every single one of their games. DHX is following in Blizzard's footsteps, responding to criticism and complaints with, "You will care about this thing because we think it's really cool." The ability to pluck out genuinely bad criticisms made by idiots may veil this, but the fundamental intention was to try and paint their critics as hysterical lunatics whining about nothing. Defanging bad criticism is my job. Don't try to do my job, DHX. You're not very good at it. You can barely do the job you have now.
This journal cover to cover, and I have to say your character would have been much more interesting if she'd stayed in Canterlot.
My character? We are real ponies.
No, you're not.